Tonight, we settle one of history's great debates. Which royal bloodline suffered more from the consequences of extreme inbreeding? Charles II of Spain or King Tutankhamun? Welcome to Historical Versus, the channel that puts history on trial. On one side, we have Charles II, the Habsburg monarch, whose family tree resembled a pretzel more than a branching oak. On the other, Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh born from a dynasty where brother-sister marriages weren't just permitted, they were divine mandate. Imagine standing in the opulent yet stifling royal chambers of the Alcazar Palace in 17th century Madrid. Before you slouches a man with a drooling jaw, so pronounced it prevents him from chewing, suffering seizures as courtiers whisper about his inability to produce an heir, the last gasp of a once mighty dynasty. Now, transport yourself to ancient Egypt's royal palace, where a teenage pharaoh hobbles on a clubfoot, leaning on his walking stick, his skull misshapen beneath the weight of his ceremonial crown, ruling briefly before an early death. So, before we begin the trial, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy seeing history's darkest chapters put under the microscope. Now, let's light the torches and step into the arena. Royal inbreeding wasn't just a bad habit, it was deliberate dynastic policy. For millennia, royal families across the globe believed that power should remain concentrated within bloodlines deemed superior by divine right. This biological experiment in genetic roulette produced some of history's most physically compromised rulers. The stakes couldn't be higher. Both monarchs wielded immense power despite their physical limitations. Both represented the culmination of generations of familial intermarriage. Both became cautionary tales in the consequences of genetic insularity. So, to fairly judge which monarch suffered the greater consequences of inbreeding, we'll examine 4 key criteria. First, the coefficient of inbreeding. Essentially, how tangled was their family tree? Modern geneticists can calculate this value, giving us a scientific measure of consanguinity. Second, physical and mental manifestations. What deformities, disabilities, and health issues did they experience as a result? Third, ruling capacity. How did their genetic inheritance affect their ability to govern? And finally, dynastic impact. Did their condition contribute to the fall of their royal house? 2 royal houses, separated over 3,000 years, but united by the same fatal flaw: the belief that royal blood must remain undiluted, even as it slowly poisoned itself. In the Habsburg court, Charles II was called El Hechizado, the bewitched, as if only black magic could explain his condition. In Egypt, Tutankhamun's physical frailties were hidden beneath golden splendor and divine mythology. Both were born into systems that sacrificed biological health at the altar of political expediency. Both paid the price in their bodies and minds. Both became genetic dead ends for once great dynasties. So, who truly suffered more from royal inbreeding? Whose dynasty paid the higher price for keeping power within the family? Literally. Tonight, we put consanguinity itself on trial, as we examine the biological tragedy of power preserved at all costs.
Charles II of Spain, the Habsburg monarch whose family tree doesn't branch so much as fold in on itself like a royal origami project. When geneticists calculated his genetic inbreeding coefficient, they found it reached 0.254, higher than what you'd get from a parent-child union or brother-sister union. To put that in perspective, you're standing in the presence of a man more inbred than the offspring of siblings. You find yourself in the Spanish court of the late 17th century. The air is thick with incense, used partly for religious purposes, but mostly to mask the smell emanating from the king. Charles rarely bathes. His fragile health won't allow it, and courtiers have learned to breathe shallowly in his presence. As he shuffles toward you, the first thing you notice is his face. His lower jaw protrudes so severely that his teeth cannot meet, making both eating and speaking nearly impossible tasks. His tongue is oversized for his mouth, causing him to drool constantly. The courtiers pretend not to notice as saliva dribbles onto his elaborate royal collar. The infamous Habsburg jaw had been present in his family for generations, but in Charles, it reached its grotesque conclusion. One contemporary described him as short, weak, and rather sickly. He has a very long face with a German chin. That diplomatic understatement barely captures the reality before you. Charles's elongated head houses a brain that struggles with the basic functions of governance. He learned to speak at age 4, to walk at age 8, and some historians suggest he never learned to read or write properly. You follow Charles through his daily routine, which includes elaborate religious rituals meant to protect his fragile body and mind. His superstition borders on obsession. Perhaps because when science can't explain your condition, divine intervention seems the only possibility. The Spanish called him el hechizado, the bewitched, because surely only a curse could explain such profound deformities in God's chosen ruler. The Habsburg dynasty had practiced strategic intermarriage for generations, creating what geneticists call the Habsburg trap, where each marriage designed to consolidate power actually increased genetic damage. If Charles's family tree were displayed at a modern genetic counseling session, it would set off more red flags than a Soviet military parade. His parents, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. His grandparents were first cousins. All 8 of his great-grandparents descended from just 4 people. In the Habsburg genealogy, ancestors appear in multiple places on the family tree, creating a genetic echo chamber where recessive traits became amplified with each generation. The results were catastrophic. Beyond his infamous Habsburg jaw, Charles suffered from an oversized head, stunted growth, and a chest that caved inward. His skeletal frame could barely support his royal robes. You notice how courtiers must sometimes physically prop him up during long ceremonies. By some accounts, his body contained so much genetic damage that he didn't undergo normal puberty and was essentially infertile. Perhaps most disturbing is the cultural protocol surrounding Charles's health. Court physicians kept detailed records of his bowel movements, which were often black and included pieces of his intestinal lining. These were presented to foreign ambassadors as proof of his continued survival. Imagine being the French diplomat receiving the Royal Stool Report with breakfast, an experience that would make even the most hardened modern medical professional blanch. When Charles attempts to speak to you, the words come out garbled and incomprehensible. His Habsburg lip is so pronounced that articulation is almost impossible. Historians still debate the extent of his cognitive impairments, but contemporary accounts suggest significant developmental delays. Some reported seizures that courtiers attributed to demonic possession, rather than the neurological disorders that modern medicine would diagnose. You watch as Charles is fed specially prepared meals that require minimal chewing. His Habsburg jaw is so misaligned that biting is impossible. In an era where the average person already had poor dental health, Charles's condition was exceptionally debilitating. Imagine struggling to eat even when surrounded by the finest food Spain's global empire could provide. A king starving at his own feast. If Charles II were alive today, he would qualify for extensive medical interventions, orthodontic surgery, physical therapy, speech therapy, and likely treatment for epilepsy. Modern genetic counseling would red flag his parents' union and every Habsburg marriage for generations before. What his dynasty viewed as political brilliance, modern medicine would classify as a preventable genetic disaster. The tragedy reaches its zenith in the bedroom. Charles married twice in desperate attempts to produce an heir. His court gossip swirled around you about his inability to consummate either marriage. The royal line ends in royal impotence, a courtier whispers, a statement that would prove prophetic. Charles's body, the final product of generations of inbreeding, would become the genetic dead end of the Spanish Habsburg line. With no heir of his body, Charles's death in 1700 triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that redrew the map of Europe. Imagine being so inbred that your inability to reproduce literally causes a continental war. That's what happens when your family tree has fewer branches than a telephone pole. The Spanish Empire, once spanning the globe with territories on every inhabited continent, began its terminal decline under a king whose body symbolized the dynasty's genetic collapse. Charles wasn't just a victim of inbreeding, he was its ultimate conclusion, a human embodiment of genetic mathematics taken to their extreme. As you observe Charles in his final years, his body frail and his mind confused, you're witnessing not just personal tragedy, but dynastic suicide through selective breeding. The Habsburg jaw finally closed, not with strength, but with a whimper that echoed across Europe.
King Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh whose family tree resembles a ladder more than a branching oak. You're now transported over 3,000 years back in time to ancient Egypt, where the 18th dynasty's approach to keeping bloodlines pure would make even the most ardent eugenicist raise an eyebrow. When modern geneticists conducted DNA analysis on Tutankhamun's mummy, they confirmed what Egyptologists had long suspected. His parents were brother and sister, giving him an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25, just a hair below Charles II's record-setting score. You stand in the royal palace at Thebes, watching as servants help the teenage pharaoh dress for court. At first glance, he seems draped in divine splendor, gold jewelry adorning his arms, ceremonial makeup highlighting his eyes, and the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt perched upon his head. But as he moves toward you, the facade of divine perfection crumbles. Tut walks with a pronounced limp, his left foot turned inward in a severe clubfoot deformity. In his hand, not as ceremonial decoration but as practical necessity, he clutches a walking stick. You count dozens of these canes in his possession. Unlike the purely ceremonial ones found in earlier pharaohs' tombs, Tut's show actual wear patterns at the tips. Imagine being the living embodiment of a sun god who can't cross a room without assistance, the divine falcon Horus with a broken wing. As Tut settles onto his throne, you notice his unusual skull shape, elongated and misshapen in a way that no royal headdress can fully conceal. This wasn't ritual head binding, it was congenital, the result of generations of incestuous marriages. The ancient Egyptians might have seen this as a mark of divinity, but you're looking at hydrocephalus, where spinal fluid builds up and deforms the skull. His teeth are in disarray too, with a severe overbite that makes his upper teeth protrude noticeably. A dental condition that would have modern orthodontists designing a special pharaonic brace. The royal court of Egypt had elevated inbreeding to theological necessity. While European monarchs would later claim divine right, Egyptian pharaohs went several steps further. They claimed to be living gods. The practice of brother-sister marriage, virtually unheard of in other ancient societies, was justified because the pharaohs were considered divine beings, not subject to human taboos. Tut's grandfather, Amenhotep III, married several of his daughters, and Tut's father, Akhenaten, likely married his own sister Nefertiti to produce Tutankhamun. The royal family tree of the 18th dynasty resembles a game of genetic Jenga. Remove any piece, and the whole structure wobbles precariously. You observe Tut attempting to participate in the morning hunt, a traditional pharaonic activity. Even mounting his chariot requires assistance from several servants. Evidence suggests his physical limitations were severe. Over 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb, along with bows designed for someone who couldn't exert significant pulling strength. CT scans of his mummy reveal a fracture in his left femur that likely occurred shortly before death and may have become infected. In a modern emergency room, this would be a routine case requiring antibiotics and perhaps surgery. In ancient Egypt, it was apparently a death sentence for the living god. Historians still debate whether Tutankhamun's physical ailments were the direct cause of his premature death, or simply contributing factors to a life cut short by other means. What's certain is that medical analysis of his mummy reveal a physically frail young man with multiple congenital disorders. Beyond his clubfoot and malformed skull, he suffered from scoliosis, curvature of the spine, and had unusually feminine hip structure. Another potential result of genetic disorders from inbreeding. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence found in Tut's tomb suggesting his struggle with malaria. Genetic testing of his mummified tissues revealed the presence of Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite that causes the most severe form of malaria. The combination of congenital weakness and this parasitic infection would have been devastating. Imagine fighting off a serious disease with an immune system already compromised by genetic fragility. It's like entering a boxing match with both hands tied behind your back. The ancient Egyptians believed the pharaoh's body contained magical properties that maintained cosmic order. The irony of watching the living embodiment of divine perfection struggle with basic mobility would not have been lost on the court physicians who treated him. one particularly macabre detail from Egyptian royal protocol. The pharaoh's body waste was examined daily, not just for health reasons, but because everything from the god-king's body was considered sacred. Yes, even divine feces were worthy of reverence. Perhaps the earliest example of the royal flush in human history. When Tut sits for the royal meal, you notice servants have pre-cut his food into tiny morsels. Recent analysis of his teeth suggests he may have struggled with basic chewing functions. The living embodiment of Ra, the sun god, couldn't bite an apple. How can he be expected to vanquish the forces of chaos? The young pharaoh's reproductive challenges proved equally problematic for the dynasty. CT scans of Tutankhamun's mummy show underdeveloped physique consistent with feminizing genetic disorders. Though he married his half-sister, Tutankhamun, keeping that genetic pool nice and shallow, the royal couple produced only 2 daughters, both stillborn. Their mummified remains were found in his tomb, tiny bundles testifying to the genetic dead end the royal line had reached. If Charles II's Habsburg jaw prevented Spain from chewing European politics properly, Tut's genetic inheritance prevented Egypt from continuing its most powerful dynasty. You witness courtiers discussing the succession crisis in hushed tones. With no living heir, Tut's death at approximately 19 years of age would end the direct 18th dynasty bloodline. His vizier, Ai, would take the throne after him, followed by the general Harembeb, non-royal usurpers who attempted to legitimize their rule by marrying into the royal family. The divine bloodline that Egyptians had worked so hard to preserve through inbreeding ultimately destroyed itself through that very practice. If Tutankhamun were alive today, he'd likely face numerous surgeries from birth, orthopedic interventions for his clubfoot and spine, neurological monitoring for his skull deformities, and comprehensive genetic counseling. Modern medicine might have extended his life, but the genetic damage was done before he drew his first breath. What the Egyptians saw as preserving divine essence, modern genetics recognizes as a textbook case of recessive genetic disorders amplified through consanguinity. As you watch the boy king struggle through the basic functions of governance and daily life, it becomes clear that the golden mask that would cover his face for millennia concealed a biological reality far less glorious than his divine mythology suggested.
The cases have been made. The evidence is in. It's time for the final showdown. 2 monarchs separated by over 3 millennia, but united by the twisted branches of their family trees, now face each other across the courtroom of history. Let's begin with the cold, hard numbers. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient stands at an astonishing 0.254. slightly edging out Tutankhamun's 0.25. By the narrowest of margins, Charles takes the dubious honor of being more inbred than the product of a brother-sister union. I find it remarkable that 2 royal houses, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, managed to achieve nearly identical levels of genetic self-sabotage. The difference between them is mathematical splitting of hairs. But genetics is just the beginning. The physical manifestations of inbreeding present our first stark contrast. Charles suffered primarily in his face and mouth. The Habsburg jaw rendered him barely able to speak or eat. Tut's afflictions centered on mobility. His clubfoot and femoral necrosis left him dependent on walking sticks from childhood. Charles' body betrayed him externally. Tut's failed him structurally. Which is worse, being unable to properly chew your food or being unable to walk without assistance? I would argue that Tut's mobility issues were more immediately debilitating. Charles could be carried in a litter when necessary. Food could be specially prepared. But Tut's inability to perform the physical ceremonies expected of a pharaoh, hunting, warfare, ritual athletics, struck at the very heart of Egyptian kingship ideology. A pharaoh was Horus incarnate, a divine athlete. A physically compromised pharaoh contradicted the very mythology of Egyptian kingship. When we examine cognitive function, Charles clearly suffered more severely. While records of Tut's mental capacity remain limited, nothing suggests significant cognitive impairment. Charles, however, exhibited clear developmental delays, struggled with basic education, and demonstrated behaviors consistent with intellectual disability. Contemporary accounts describe episodes that modern medicine would likely identify as seizures. His mental limitations severely compromised his ability to rule effectively. Their reigns could hardly have been more different. Charles ruled for 35 years, giving us ample evidence of his incompetence. Tutankhamun took the throne at roughly age 9 and died by 19, with most decisions made by his vizier, and General Horemheb. Charles had time to thoroughly demonstrate his inadequacy. Tut never had the chance to rule independently. Is it worse to rule poorly for decades or barely rule at all? I contend that Charles suffered the greater tragedy. Decades of being expected to perform duties he was fundamentally incapable of fulfilling. Both monarchs struggled with fertility, a classic consequence of inbreeding. Charles married twice, but produced no heirs, despite years of trying. Tutankhamun and his sister wife conceived twice, but both daughters were stillborn. Their mummified fetuses tell a poignant story of genetic collapse. On this measure, they stand equally tragic, both representing genetic dead ends for once mighty dynasties. The historical stakes of their reproductive failures could not have been higher. Charles' death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a continent-wide conflict that redrew the map of Europe and ended Habsburg Spain. Tutankhamun's death led to a succession crisis that ultimately ended Egypt's 18th dynasty, arguably its most powerful royal house. Both were the last gasps of storied bloodlines. Yet here Charles faces greater historical accountability. Tut died as a teenager, before he could be held fully responsible for governance. Charles had decades of adult rule, during which Spain declined precipitously. The Spanish Empire, once spanning the globe, began its terminal descent under his ineffectual leadership. While Tut's bloodline ended with him, the Egyptian civilization continued for centuries. Spain's global power effectively collapsed with Charles. When we consider the cultural contexts, Tutankhamun's inbreeding at least had religious justification. Egyptian royal incest maintained the divine bloodline of the gods. The Habsburgs had no such mythological imperative. Their inbreeding was purely political, a cynical strategy to keep lands and titles within the family. Charles's condition resulted from cold political calculation,
Toots from religious doctrine. Is suffering for divine mandate more noble than suffering for territorial ambition? I would argue it granted Toots' condition at least a veneer of cultural purpose that Charles lacked. Both kings lived lives of immense privilege, yet profound limitation. Both were trapped in bodies compromised by their ancestors' choices. Both died knowing their bloodlines would perish with them. But Charles lived longer with his limitations, ruling as an adult fully aware of his inadequacies, while Tutankhamun's life ended before he could fully comprehend the dynastic tragedy he embodied. As we weigh the evidence, a pattern emerges. Charles endured longer suffering, bore greater responsibility, and presided over a more consequential decline. Tutankhamun's tragedy, while profound, was briefer and partially obscured by the golden mask that would preserve his image for millennia.
The verdict in this case hinges not merely on genetic mathematics, but on the human cost of inbreeding across multiple dimensions. After weighing the evidence, I find that Charles II of Spain endured the greater tragedy of royal inbreeding. The reasoning behind this verdict is multifaceted. First, Charles suffered longer. While Tutankhamun's life was cut tragically short at approximately 19 years, Charles endured 35 years of physical and mental impairment. His longer lifespan meant more accumulated suffering, more awareness of his limitations, and more time to comprehend his failure to continue his dynasty. Second, Charles bore greater responsibility. Tutankhamun ascended the throne as a child and died as a young man, with powerful regents making most decisions. Charles ruled as an adult for decades, bearing the full weight of governance despite being fundamentally unequipped for the task. The cognitive impairments that Charles exhibited, which appear more severe than any we can attribute to Tutankhamun, rendered his long reign an exercise in painful inadequacy. Third, Charles's death proved more historically catastrophic. Both monarchs represented the end of their direct bloodlines, but Charles's death triggered a war that engulfed Europe and accelerated Spain's decline as a global power. The Habsburg dynasty's genetic collapse in Spain had immediate geopolitical ramifications that exceeded the dynastic transition following Tutankhamun's death. Fourth, Charles lacked the cultural framework that gave meaning to Tutankhamun's condition. Egyptian royal inbreeding operated within a theological system that justified brother-sister marriages as maintaining divine bloodlines. The Habsburgs practiced inbreeding purely for political advantage, a cynical strategy that lacked even the veneer of sacred purpose. Charles suffered not for divine mandate, but for territorial ambition. This is not to minimize Tutankhamun's suffering. The young pharaoh's physical limitations, particularly his mobility issues, would have contradicted the Egyptian ideal of the pharaoh as divine athlete. The evidence of his numerous walking sticks, his clubfoot, and his fractured femur paint a picture of physical frailty at odds with the golden image of Egyptian kingship. Yet when we consider the totality of circumstances, the duration of suffering, the awareness of inadequacy, the historical stakes, and the cultural context, Charles II emerges as the more profound victim of dynastic inbreeding. The Habsburg jaw that had developed over generations reached its grotesque conclusion in Charles, rendering basic functions like eating and speaking difficult. His reported cognitive limitations restricted his education and governance capacity. His physique was so compromised that contemporary accounts describe him as sickly from birth to death. And perhaps most poignantly, he lived long enough to understand his own limitations and the dynastic consequences of his infertility. Both cases revealed the biological price of political expediency. Both demonstrate how dynasties can engineer their own destruction through genetic insularity. Both should serve as cautionary tales about prioritizing bloodline purity over biological health. In Charles II, we see inbreeding's most extreme expression, a monarch so genetically compromised that his very existence challenged the divine right theory underpinning his authority. In Tutankhamun, we see a briefer tragedy, a young ruler whose potential remained largely unrealized due to congenital limitations and early death. The verdict is in. Charles II suffered the greater consequences of royal inbreeding, embodying its fullest horror in both body and mind. But history is never that simple. Who gets your vote? Cast your judgment in the comments below. And thanks for watching Historical Verses.